Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this panel discussion on the question of design recovery, strategic resilience for the new normal. I'm really looking forward to it. We have four great panelists with us today. Richard Hammond from Cornerstone Architecture, Fan Zhang from Awadi, Kiara Copps-Edwards from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and Mike Szabo from Diamond Schmidt Architects. I want to begin, though, first by acknowledging, recognizing, and respecting that all of the land that we build on and the land that we do our work on is Indigenous land, and it is the traditional territories of the many First Nations of Turtle Island here in Canada. We want to acknowledge our mutual responsibility to share and care for these lands and all the creatures that inhabit them. I'll start by introducing myself as well. My name is John Stevenson. I'm an architect, founding partner, principal in Forum Studio Architects in Thunder Bay, and a past president of the Ontario Association of Architects. And it's really a pleasure, as I said, to be here to moderate this discussion. Today's discussion is going to focus on two key questions. The first one is, how do we design recovery? We think about this as we come out of the pandemic into a transition back to what everybody is describing will be a new normal, and what exactly is that new normal. And then the second key question that we hope to discuss today is how, in this period of recovery, does the work of design change, evolve, and adapt? What are the challenges in front of us, and what are the opportunities that those challenges present? We're going to begin with some remarks by each of the panelists. The first two are going to be presented by a pre-recorded video, and I'll introduce those two panelists first. First up will be Fan Zhang from Awadi, which stands for Awesome, Awesome Design. It's a great firm name. I love it. Fan Zhang founded her practice, Awadi, in 2015. She graduated from the University of Toronto with a bachelor's in applied science and engineering and a master's in architecture. Before starting Awadi, Fan has worked in numerous architecture offices, including HWKN in New York, BIG in Copenhagen, MAD in Beijing, and B+H in Toronto. Her built work ranges from single-family housing to institutional complexes. Through her experience working and living in different countries and cultures, Fan has developed a great passion for the cross-discipline of vernacular architecture and modern social communities. The second video presented will be from Richard Hammond of Cornerstone Architecture. Richard Hammond is the founder and principal at Cornerstone Architecture Incorporated in London, Ontario. Since its establishment in 1991, Cornerstone's work has focused on four sectors: design for children, design for community, design for education, and design for the elderly. Cornerstone is also active in the design of green and high-performance buildings. In 2004, Richard became a LEED accredited professional through the Canadian Green Building Council, which led to an ongoing interest and involvement in the design of sustainable buildings and communities. He became a Green Globe certified professional in 2009. In 2011, he completed an online graduate program in sustainable technology at Arizona State University. In 2017, he completed the executive program at Singularity University in Palo Alto and continues to participate in this network of leaders in emerging technologies. Also in 2017, and Richard, I don't know how you found time to do all this, he received a Master's of Environment and Resource Studies from the University of Waterloo. His thesis focused on impacts of buildings on the urban environment and the merits of green versus blue roof systems. So we'll turn it over to the studio to run the two videos now, and then I'll follow with the introductions of our second two speakers.
Hello, everybody. My name is Fan. I am a licensed architect in Ontario with the OAA. And I run my office in Toronto. The name is Awadi for Awesome, Awesome Designs. So thank you for inviting me to this talk today at the conference. The pandemic has been going on for over a year now. A year in a normal situation passes by in a blink like that. But this past year has been dreadfully long for many people. And it has made tremendous impacts on the way we live. And I think, therefore, the way architecture might become. So in this talk today, I'd like to focus on three aspects of these impacts, which might become the next normal. The first one is impacts on households. The second one is impacts on the larger scale projects, such as our communities, our cityscapes, the urban parks, our schools, and etc. And finally, the impacts on the social and psychological aspects. So I think the pandemic has both isolated people and brought people together in a weird way. All family members are jammed in the same household almost 24/7. There used to be these venues, which I call escape venues, such as coffee shops, gyms, and restaurants and bars and shops that we can escape to sometimes, either to just to have some alone time or to socialize. But those venues basically have stopped, and all of that have moved into people's homes. That means there are kids attending online classes at home while the family members are trying to juggle between their yoga poses, brewing coffees, having a virtual meeting with their colleagues, or even cooking dinner. So the household scene has transformed from maybe quiet most of the time to really chaotic all the time. And I've heard many complaints from people, including friends, family, and clients during this period. One of them is the lack of space. This is a great concern for many, just because we're staying in our homes now all the time. The second biggest complaint would be the lack of proper office setup. So I'm talking about chairs, desks, computers, equipment, and or even lighting. And they contribute to the lack of comfort in their home environment and sometimes even physical issues. But among all of these, the largest complaint that I have heard or issues for families is the lack of privacy most people are facing. So because of all of these reasons, families are flocking from cities to the suburbs and cottage countries for bigger spaces and more outdoor exposure. And we've seen how that has played out or is still playing out in the real estate market in the past half a year. People are just going into bidding wars. They want to get out of the city and they want to have their own bigger houses to live in. And that certainly created a shift in paradigm in the way people experience architecture and people's demand from architecture. So I think there's a shift on the quality of space that people might not realize before. Generally, people are now much more aware of the limitations and the qualities of the spaces that they occupy. Their emphasis on homes went from maybe location, efficiency, and maybe compactness to more focus on comfort, spatialness, and functionality. They pay a lot more attention to things such as the ergonomics of furniture, the lighting quality, how much natural lighting they're getting in the space, their cooking and dining spaces, the access to outdoor areas, and again, their privacy. I think this might be a good shift for our industry because people are now much more aware of the spatial quality compared to before. And just kind of analyzing from the talks I've been having with my clients, they start thinking and talking about parameters that we are very used to and always talk about, such as ceiling height. They need to have higher ceilings so they can do exercises at home. They talk about the circulation from one area to another area, the adjacency between programs. And they also talk about visual and audio separations between spaces, the natural lighting, the flexibility of layout, and so on. So I think now people would appreciate good designs more than before. On the other hand, the demand for more room is just immense. Clients for residential projects, they want to have bigger footprints, more rooms, and taller ceiling heights because everything is done at home now. But I think the issue that we are facing and probably will be facing for at least the next short while is that that kind of demand for more room and maybe higher buildings is something that the zoning bylaws haven't caught up to yet. And it's going to probably take a long time for the legislative bodies to react to this sudden surge in the demand for space and the change in the use of homes if the pandemic continues for a long time. So I think in the meanwhile, as designers and architects, to solve the issue of lack of privacy and functional spaces in these households, we need to ask ourselves several questions, or I've been asking myself several questions. So, one of the question is the answer simply to go bigger, and get more spaces for everybody? Or is there something that we can do design-wise to tackle these issues? And the imminent demands for homeowners, will that last, depending on how long the pandemic is going to be? Is that something that's going to have a permanent effect on the housing market, or is that going to be something more temporary that people realize after the pandemic is done that they are willing to move back to the cities again and all of this kind of go away? I don't have an answer to these, but I think these would be really interesting questions to think about and to discuss. All right, so the second aspect is on the larger scale. Because again, people are flocking from cities to suburbs. We've seen how that transformed our city centers and streetscapes, how streets that were once populated are now almost desolated. Many parks and facilities in the cities are shut down, and local businesses are either closed temporarily or, very sadly, permanently. In urban design and architectural theory classes, we always talk about urban sprawl, how that changes our cities and our suburbs, and etc. I think the pandemic is stimulating urban sprawl at a pace that we've never seen before. It is changing our households, our communities, and our entire city infrastructures. I'm not sure how permanent, again, this outward migration will be and how much of a ripple effect this will impose on the future of our cities. But I think that will depend on how long the pandemic will last. What I do know is that rules such as social distancing has imposed implications on the designs of our public spaces, or at least raised enough awareness for improvement. So at the minimum, public facilities would start exploring design options to control crowd contact. So I heard this really interesting example from a friend that is living and working in New York. So the Bloomberg head office in New York is looking at redesigning their elevator system so that their employees will no longer be able to press the elevator buttons, but instead they're using this so-called smart elevator system, where the entire system is run automatically on programmed schedules. And the reason for that is because people realize that, we're practicing social distancing, but when you're trying to get onto the elevators during rush hour, there's a jam. There's a lot of people packed in that really small space that potentially could be contagious. So to continue this example, in a recent report released by Markets and Markets, the smart elevator market will be worth $12.6 billion by 2026. I think this small example shows how our building industry is already reacting to the pandemic and planning for future measures. Even though we may not realize it yet, I think changes are already underway. Another change that is underway is the office culture that people are used to. So work from home policies have been implemented by many offices because of the pandemic, because we have to. Some industries and companies are forced to realize all those infrastructures to support work from home. And I guess from that process of setting up this infrastructure and forced into practicing that, many companies realize that working from home is not only possible, but might also potentially be desirable. So when these infrastructures are already in place, The question is, will our work environment ever fall back to how it was before? If the work from home culture becomes the new norm, the centralized office buildings in the CBD areas, for example, downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa, those areas, the concentrated work areas in those CBDs, they will slowly be replaced by the decentralized home offices all across the country. And if that happens, what will happen to, for example, the businesses that used to focus around this workforce? Will they shut down or will they move to the suburbs as well? The transit and transportation system that's already in place, again, supporting people moving from all areas of the city to the center and then, transporting them back to their homes again. Will we need such a robust infrastructure for the future? I think it will also have implications on public spaces and urban parks, and most importantly, on our communities. I think these will be the changes that we'll need to consider if the current situation becomes the new norm. So moving on to the third aspect, unfortunately, no one has the crystal ball to tell if the pandemic will ever end or when it will end. This means any planning and decisions made during this period carries a risk with it. So I've seen in my practice during this period that decisions are getting delayed whenever possible. And this, to some extent, affects the projects and design firms in our industry. So to give you an example, everybody probably already know, lumber price has gone up 200% from April 2020 to this year. This affects the entire residential market. Some homeowners would like to pause on their project, hoping that the price of lumber will eventually go down. Others who just start out a project are looking for alternative design options. So they're asking questions like, should we go with a concrete building? Should we go with a steel building instead? Et cetera, and et cetera. And architects, I think, need to compensate for these shifts in the market and probably reflect those changes in their designs. And on other projects where delay is not an option, then spatial flexibility is often sought after to account for the fact of this unpredictability that's going on. So I've talked to restaurant and bar owners who are looking to expand their outdoor spaces because of the regulation changes. They feel having more outdoor space means that it will bring more business to them. I've talked to office and personal service owners who are looking to completely open up their floor plates so that they can shuffle things around if needed. I think there's also an important social aspect in this as well. As individuals, we're experiencing a social cutoff between us from the rest of the world. Simultaneously, there is this forced social grouping within a household. On top of that, this uncertainty of what will happen and how long this state of isolation will last is very unsettling. So I think the population as a whole right now is suffering from a societal anxiety. Again, if this becomes the new norm, as architects and designers, we need to address maybe somehow this kind of social anxiety. So the question would be, how do we reestablish this desired social connections between people for the sake of our mental health, while maintaining a reasonable physical distance to protect our physical health? Or maybe is that even possible? I don't really have an answer to that yet. And I hope this could be a discussion that we open up to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Richard Hammond, the founder and principal of Cornerstone Architecture based in London, Ontario. We were established in 1991, and we currently have a team of about 26 people. We practice in 4 areas: buildings for children, for community, for education, and for the elderly. We also do a lot of work in high-performing and green buildings. And with all our projects, our emphasis on client collaboration and a high degree of involvement with our clients throughout the process. And we actually have a trademark system we use called our collaborative design system. When I think about this issue of design recovery, my thoughts really start with our firm itself. We've developed what we think is a healthy culture here, and we've worked hard at that over the last 30 years. We've used a lot of ways of kind of testing that. This is an example of one of those ways, a word cloud that captures responses when we ask people, what they felt was most important about, being part of the team here at Cornerstone. So with the last months of the pandemic and having to work remotely, it was surprising how easily we were able to make that transition, actually. And in fact, we've learned some good habits that we'll probably keep, I hope, when we do get back together, least of which is staying home if you're not feeling well. And for us, remote meetings were very common, before we had to split up, and they're going to be even more common, I think, when we get back together. And like everyone else, we've all had to adapt to an all online working environment. And I think we're still learning how to take advantage of that medium and how to make communication better. And this is a resource that I found extremely helpful and insightful, called Digital Body Language by Erica Dewan. And one of the key quotes is that she feels online, reading carefully is the new listening. Writing clearly is the new empathy, and a phone or video call is worth 1,000 emails. So this is something I think we're going to look to as we get better at communicating, even once we are back together. With the time that we've been apart, I think we've forgotten what's important about being in a studio environment together. Especially for architectural practices. And, the fact is that working remotely makes it even harder to set limits for ourselves between work and life. And therefore, I think we've got some work to do about reminding one another about why we do work together. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that it's going to take time to adapt to getting back together, and everything and everyone won't recover at the same pace. So for us, it's important to have some measurable indicators of how we're doing with this. And this is a great tool that we've used. It's called the Engagement Multiplier. And it's a periodic survey of your team across individual positions and groups. About how you're doing and how people feel about the various metrics we use to gauge our level of engagement. So that's something, again, I think we're going to rely on as we move forward. And the other thing that's been so important for us over the course of our practice is our community. We've done a lot of really fun things over the years here in London. This is one of them. It was a project proposed converting of one of our railway lines to a trail system. It was submitted to the 2019 Shift Awards, and we were successful in receiving an award, which was quite gratifying. And, obviously that has completely stopped over the past year, and something that, when we're ready, we really want to activate again. The other issue that we have been asked to think about at this panel is the question of paradigm shifts. And what are we going to look forward to now coming out of this experience we've all had? And I'm optimistic that climate will be the next global challenge that I think we are finally ready to take on. You know, I think this last year or so has taught us how surprisingly reliant we are on relatively fragile global supply chains. We've learned that everybody doesn't need to work in the office all the time. We've seen some changing perceptions of the urban core and high-rise environments for living and working. And of all of the information that's available to us, this idea of eco-modernism is one that I find distills the key things for us as architectural practice in a very powerful way. And the idea of eco-modernism is a kind of synthesis of environment and habitation and technology. The manifesto that you see is available, beautifully written document. I encourage anybody to download it if you're interested. And the ideas are quite contrarian actually, but very much based on evidence. And they speak to how we need to think differently about energy, land use, and our relationship with the natural world. And they make the point that although there's still some debate, the fact is there's a lot of consensus about what we need to do, and we have the tools to do it. And finally, you know, the paradigm shift for climate applies very close to home. As Canadians, we have got a lot of work to do. We are still among the highest emitters per capita in the world, and obviously very reliant still on fossil fuels. At the same time, I think we've learned the power of collective action over the course of this past year. And as Canadians, I think we've lost a little bit of our smugness about the resiliency of our resources, manufacturing, and healthcare systems. At the same time, I think we need to remind ourselves that we have a kind of unlimited resource of human ingenuity, especially in the construction sector. And I don't think many Canadians realize that we're actually global leaders in green buildings. So I think we have the capability to make a huge transformation, and I think it's a matter of just getting on with the job. Thank you.
So thank you, Fan. Thank you, Richard. Some great thoughts in both of those presentations, and we'll circle back to some questions that they raise as well. I'd like to move on to our third panelist, Chiara Copps. Chiara brings a non-architect's perspective to this panel. She represents the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. An experienced and passionate public affairs and communications professional with diverse background and experience, Chiara Copps Edwards joined the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in 2017. As Manager of Public Affairs at the OCC, Chiara leads communications and government relations on key policy issues and reports, as well as signature events such as Advocacy Day, the Ontario Economic Summit, In Discussion with Deputy Ministers, Ontario Business Achievement Awards, and the Ontario Business Advisory Council Roundtable Series. Chiara currently sits as the Communications Chair for the Ontario chapter of the Public Affairs Association of Canada. With her love for delicious food and healthy eating, Chiara started her food blog, Chiara's Kitchen, in 2013, which has grown into a sustainable business with 200 plus new and original healthy recipes, 95,000 social media followers, and 200,000 page views a month, and has been featured on Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, One Green Planet, Yahoo News, and MSN News. Chiara has a BA honors from the University of Ottawa, as well as a Master of Science in Culture in Cultural and Social Anthropology from the KU Leuven in Belgium. The KU Leuven has been ranked the most innovative university in Europe, according to Reuters. Born and raised in Toronto and having lived in Ontario, Quebec, France, and Belgium, Chiara is an adventurer who now resides back in Toronto with her dog, Henry. Chiara, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure to be here and provide the perspective of the business community among such esteemed architects. So just a bit of background for those of you who don't know, many people think the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is government, but in fact, we represent 60,000 businesses in 140 communities across the province. And, you know, something that came across to me in both videos is sort of this collective anxiety that we're all feeling right now in the pandemic. And I'd say that it's certainly palpable. And that's the same when it comes to our business community and what we can expect when we look at the transition to recovery, when we look at reopening and what that means for Ontarians, what that means for businesses, and what that means for our collective society as a whole. Since the onset of the pandemic, John, we've been quite clear that the public health of our economy and the public health of Ontarians is absolutely interconnected. We can't open our economy until it is safe to do so. And in our opinion, we can't look at sort of what the return to work will look like until we have clarity and consistency on, you know, what is going to happen after June 2nd when our public health measures change. So, you know, as I sit here in my kitchen where I made breakfast in my 400 square foot apartment, where quite frankly, if you told me 2 years ago that we'd be working on changing public policy for the reopening and the recovery of our province, you know, I wouldn't have believed you. So I think that speaks to sort of how much our lives have changed. And it's difficult to say truly what our new normal and what the return to work for those of us who work at home, for what that's going to look like. So first and foremost, I'd like to we're calling for a few things right now. And I think that will have a huge impact on not only architects, but, you know, society as a whole and businesses as a whole. We've heard a lot about evidence-based metrics, and we'd like to see evidence-based metrics in our society, and just so we know what we're working towards when it comes to reopening our province and reopening our economy. We had Dr. David Williams quote, I believe last week, that case counts need to be well below 1,000. What would be really helpful if we had something to work towards, you know, when I'm speaking to people within politics as well as outside of the political circle, when businesses are kind of preparing you know, PPE and restructuring their outdoor spaces for summer, we would like clarity on when we're going to reopen and when it will be safe to do so. We know that the vaccination campaign is well underway, and the sooner our population is vaccinated, the sooner we can return to normal. So it's wonderful to see vaccination rates on the rise. Many of us have now received our first dose, but we'd like to know how public health measures and how businesses and how our spaces will be impacted when we have all received our first dose. We've seen in other provinces like Saskatchewan and in Quebec, they've actually released public health guidelines. In Saskatchewan, they're saying when 70% of adults have received their first dose, we can look at how we're going to be interacting in spaces and interacting with each other. In the United States, we can see new CDC guidelines that state that if you receive both doses, you no longer need to social distance or wear a mask, which is, I think, quite frankly, hard to believe in the current lockdown state, which we continue to be in for the safety of each other and the safety of our businesses and our spaces and economy. So we'd like clarity around that, and we hope government will speak to that in a way that's clear and understandable for Canadians and for business owners, because quite frankly, things like 1-dose summer, 2-dose fall kind of fall short of what we can expect and what our future holds when we look at the return to work and what our future looks like. Another aspect that I believe will be critical, that's critical now, but will also be critical when we look at recovery and what the new normal looks around our spaces, I think rapid testing, as well as, of course, continuing to follow public health measures will be critical. We know that 1/3 of all cases are asymptomatic, and that's scary to think that people could be, you know, walking around in our spaces and spreading the virus in workplaces where people are not lucky, like myself, to work from home. So rapid testing along with vaccine deployment is really going to help us paint the picture of what our new normal is going to look like, and also help curb the spread, we believe, as we wait for vaccinations to roll out. That's why, in fact, we launched a rapid testing program recently with the federal government, Ontario government, as well as the Canadian Chamber, where small businesses can actually visit their local Chamber of Commerce and receive rapid tests for free, where rapid testing can become a regular part of screening employees to see if they test positive for COVID. And I think that measures such as rapid testing are going to be a critical part of our daily lives. And when we think about the new normal and getting back to work and what that's going to look like, rapid testing is definitely going to be a clear part of that. Safe and equitable operating guidelines. I mean, you know, we need a framework on how business owners and how we should all adapt to our new spaces and what that's going to look like. I think we can all remember a few months ago when we opened for just a few weeks and we saw cases rise. Well, in terms of the business perspective, it's very difficult for business owners, particularly small business owners to reopen and reclose their businesses. People are investing in PPE, in dividers, so people can safely eat their meals out in public. And you know, to invest in staffing and all of that is very expensive, especially for small business owners that don't have a lot of liquidity to see themselves through. And that's why we've seen the mass closure of so many businesses, small businesses, through this pandemic. So, you know, I'd like to see guidelines around what our spaces are going to look like, so people have some clarity around spaces and around workplaces and what society will look like out towards the end of this. The last is a critical point, and that's around what is travel going to look like? I think so many of us have family overseas and we'd love to hug a loved one, and we haven't been able to for almost a year and a half now. So we'd like to see all governments kind of work together on what smart travel will look like, so we can travel safely, so we can participate, and then when people come back into society, that they're not spreading the virus, and we can you know, work together safely in work environments and be able to congregate together and see each other again, because all of these factors are going to be critical to our reopening and our recovery and what the transition back to our new normal will look like. I think a lot of us deserve clarity as well from, you know, our employers on what the return to normal will look like. Well, in a year, will we still be working from desks in our kitchen? So then, keeping that in mind, how are our spaces going to adapt? Will condos take that into effect when we're building new apartments and new living spaces? How will our workplaces adapt in terms of hotel models or open workspaces, which a lot of workplaces moved to before the pandemic? So, you know, my last point would be that I think the pandemic has really shown the resilience of Ontarians, the resilience of employers, the resilience of all of us. And it's been 14 months now, and where the vaccine rates are on the rise, where there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We need a bit of clarity and guidance around what our new normal is going to look like.
Thank you, Kiara, for those remarks. Lots of good questions there. And again, I think we'll circle back to those after we finish the panelist presentations. Our fourth panelist and our final one before we get into the Q&A is Michael Szabo of Diamond Schmidt Architects. Michael thinks big. Many of his projects at Diamond Schmidt are large-scale, multi-year undertakings that transform institutions and communities. Master planning and designing the 18 million square foot Vaughan Metropolitan Center represents a new paradigm for transforming suburbs into dense, mixed-use urban placemaking. The Peter Gilligan Center for Research and Learning at the Hospital for Sick Children redefined medical research design as one of the largest laboratories in the high-rise form. This 21-story LEED Gold Tower is designed for interdisciplinary exchange to enhance collaboration and interaction and support the new mantra of team science. Michael is a passionate advocate for green buildings and led the integrated sustainable design for the University of Ontario Institute of Technology Campus Master Plan and Buildings, which received the RAIC Award of Innovation Excellence and the SCUP Award, SCUP Award for Campus Design. He was instrumental in developing Ecometrics, a data-driven tool for comparative energy use modeling. Not everything, however, Michael designs is on a grand scale. The Camilla and Peter Dalglish atrium at the Royal Botanical Gardens integrates a delicate sunlit gathering space within the landscape. He's also designed the Living Laboratory of Sustainability at McMaster University's Hatch Center. Michael, we look forward to your introductory comments.
Thanks, John. Sorry for the terrible names that I forced you to pronounce there. So good morning, everyone. So in preparation for today, John asked us to share our thoughts on how our practice and our design approach will change through and into post-pandemic environments. While the pandemic has been an incredibly challenging time, it has also been a catalyst to provoke change. It's daylighted many of the vulnerabilities in our social, economic, and cultural structures, laying bare a wide range of inequities and problems within. On the other hand, it's been a remarkable time for reflection and radical change, marking an end of some things and the beginning of others. Beyond the amazing development and deployment of vaccines globally, which is extraordinary, it's also been remarkable how literally over a weekend, we collectively made the leap from working in our offices to shifting with relative ease to a virtual environment. What was for me an impossible concept on a Thursday became a viable reality on the following Monday. Clearly, technological groundwork for this had been in the works for a very long time, and COVID was simply the tipping point in the process. During the last year, we've started to explore the possibilities of what this offers, both in terms of how we work and what we design. Firstly, as one of the larger firms in Canada, we've been working for a number of years to enhance our ability to share knowledge and expertise within our firm. We've been striving to find ways, in a really simple way, to allow us as individuals to leverage our collective knowledge and expertise within the firm. Prior to our firm moving to a virtual format, our platform for communication and education tended to rely on in-person presentations and meetings, a kind of analog version. And over the last year, we've made a big transformation. Our intranet, our blog or means of communication known as DSX, has become an essential platform for communication and discourse across our firm. Our forum for knowledge sharing, which we call DSU, has gone virtual and has been broadened to engage both members of our firm and experts across the country and beyond. And our training platform shifted from lunchtime seminars to a library of on-demand learning. Most amazing, our teams in Toronto, Vancouver, New York, Calgary, and Ottawa, which historically were challenged by geography in terms of connectivity, are now all on equal footing. In many ways, the remote offices everybody has said they now feel more connected to the firm as a holistic entity than they ever have in the past. And there's a real anxiety about the future where they would be returning to an isolated satellite location. The pandemic has pushed us to take a leap to a far more integrated environment, collapsing silos and flattening communication. We've seen a lot of opportunity where all members of the firm have an equal voice in a way which is far more transformative than ever before. Secondly, the virtual office has, for many, been a great opportunity for their increased flexibility, providing a window into a new form of work-life balance. While the pandemic has been extremely challenging for young families trying to balance work and childcare, as Fan mentioned, and it has taken a big toll on our collective mental health, it has also demonstrated that a flexible work structure is both possible and desirable in many respects. This said, we are in the business of finding creative solutions to problems. That is our bread and butter. I think we all long in our firm for the opportunity to return to the studio to take advantage of what I call a kind of organic intelligence of us working together and collaborating with one another. While we have over the last year developed our skills in project management and team communications and a methodology to break down problems in a linear logistical fashion in a kind of one step at a time way, we believe that there really is no substitution for collaborating directly with one another. The challenge that we face going forward is how do we balance these two agendas, which in many ways seem a little bit at competing odds with one another. Lastly, the amping up of the virtual environment has accelerated many fundamental changes in the sectors that we work. Retail is shifting towards online shopping, and that's accelerated a demise of commercial retail development. Workplace design will inevitably be transformed by this hybrid work environment that we were just talking about. Our homes, as Fan mentioned, are being asked to do far more than ever before. The shift that we've seen in the healthcare system, which I personally found extraordinary, is really the thin end of the wedge of a radical rethinking of healthcare across our societies. In terms of cultural institutions, the reach that has opened up through the pandemic for any small organization has been extraordinary, and the ability for us to participate and engage in events globally is extraordinary and something that I wouldn't want to see go back. And lastly, the platforms for education have been really radically rethought, and the question is what happens next. But most extraordinary is when we step back and say, what's the aggregate impact of all these changes on what drives and defines our cities and the way that we live together? The need for livable, sustainable cities is critical, and transit has played and will play a key role in this going forward. But what's most alarming is in the last year in Toronto, the TTC has seen a 55% reduction in ridership. And the comfort for people to get back onto transit as a driver in sustainable urban redevelopment has been called into question. What will our path to transit-oriented development and recovery look like in this context? Will the changes we have seen stick, or will we revert back? So from my standpoint, the most inspiring lesson we have learned from the pandemic is that radical change can happen in short order. Ideally, paradigm shifts, as Richard mentioned, can be instigated without us being pushed to the tipping point, as was the case in the pandemic. My hope is that this experience will inspire us all to be proactive champions of developing socially responsible and environmentally sustainable designs, buildings that foster individual well-being and strong communities. In our discussions yesterday, John shared an analogy that I thought was quite provocative, that this crisis has put us all under stress like a stretched elastic. The concern being that when the crisis ends, when the pressure ends, we will simply revert to our previous form. I think we all would like to think that this is not the case, and I think at this point it'd be great to turn it over to John to kind of circle back and open up the panel discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Again, great remarks and lots of great questions. And actually, your closing comment is a great segue to my first question to the panel. And I think actually I'll target this to Chiara. And it really focuses on this question of what are the challenges you think are the most important for the design community, for architects in particular, to address if we are to resist this natural human tendency, this natural human resilience to just kind of revert to the status quo once the pressure and the crisis of the pandemic passes. What do you think the most important things, Chiara, that we as architects are that we need to think about? Oh, Chiara's muted.
Apologies. I think, first when we think about lessons learned and what architects and the business community and everyone needs to take into account when we look at where we're going after this pandemic is done is inclusivity and diversity. I mean, it's been mentioned before, and it was mentioned in the remarks earlier that, this pandemic has brought to the forefront a lot of issues around women's participation in the workforce. We've seen women's labor force participation drop to its lowest in 30 years, which as a feminist, that's absolutely staggering. We need to see women at the table in terms of decision-making for our public policies and what the return to work will look like. Another two key points around solutions that I think architects as well as everyone can take into account when we look at our future and what our future may look like is our two very they seem simple but have a huge impact on our daily lives. Childcare. We know that childcare is quite frankly inaccessible and it's unaffordable in this province and in many parts of this country. How many Zoom calls have we all been on where we can see people struggling to pay attention to work and they have children running around in the background? And we know that women have borne the brunt of bear the brunt of childcare responsibilities, and they continue to as well in the pandemic. And that's one of the reasons we see such low labor force participation rates right now. So we really need to make what we need to sort of take into account childcare and making that more affordable and accessible. The last point I want to make here today is about flexible work. I think that we hear the term flexible work a lot in our daily lives. And really, what does that mean? Well, if we have more flexible work options and if we can design our spaces to be more flexible, and that's not just our workspaces, but now that our homes and our kitchens and our living rooms are our workspaces, how do we level the playing field for women around flexible work? We know that having more flexible work arrangements will have a great impact on women's participation in the workforce. We will see more women in the skilled trades, more women participating in industries where we see women not participating previously. So when we look at things like design and how we're going to design our spaces into the future, I think that flexible work is a key one that we need to take into account.
Thank you, Ciara. I'm going to throw that same question to the architects on the panel as well. But before I do, I just want to remind the audience that if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A window in the bottom of the screen, and they'll be relayed to me and I'll pass them on to the panelists. So how about you, architects? There are three of you on the panel in addition to Ciara. What do you think we need to do as a design profession to hold society and our clients to account in terms of preserving the valuable and positive lessons we've learned through this pandemic experience? Any one of you want to jump at that question? Michael,
I'll take the first shot at it. I think one of the things that has been running through the back of my mind in this conversation is, I mean, there's I think I would say I in this experience have been fortunate and have been the benefactor of what I would call pandemic privilege. Because of my profession, I have been able to work remotely, and because of access to space and amenity, in many ways I've suffered far less than others. So the question of equity, social and economic equity, is something that I think we need to work on in terms of the kind of housing we design, the kind of cities we build, the access to outdoor open spaces needs to be shifted and prioritized in a way where there's where it's not just those that can afford the live work environment, but something which is across the board. Be one thought. I'll leave some space for others to.
Richard.
I would echo Mike's comment about, in the context of what's happened in society, I think those of us who've been able to continue to practice and keep busy, albeit remotely, are very, very fortunate. I look at all the retailers across the street from my office and the little restaurants, I really wonder how many of them are going to be back even when they are able to be. So there's a saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remind our clients that, you know, there are other ways. You know, we really do know other ways to do this, to build buildings that have a lighter touch on the climate, to think differently about our communities, provide greater choices for people. And I think we are in the ideal position to start those conversations. And, you know, depending on the client over the years, as my colleagues will know, that has not been a necessarily receptive audience. But you know what? That is changing. You know, I think our society is much more aware and concerned about this planet we're going to leave to our kids and grandkids. And so I think we just have to have a little more courage and ask those questions and have those conversations to say, well, what about this? And what if we did this? And look at other ways of doing things than the same old way.
I think that's so true. And it is often the case in working with clients that the problem that clients present to you as needing solving is in fact underlain by several other problems that they don't in fact even understand or realize exist. And I think one of the important roles of architects is to probe and question the client's understanding of their own project needs so that we can address the right problems and generate the right answers as a result for them. Fan, I want to shift the conversation a little bit to something you said in your presentation. You talked about the increasing pressure towards urban sprawl. And I'm wondering how we square that with the need that we all recognize to address the climate crisis in a way that reduces our carbon footprint. And it kind of ties into your comment about the pressure to produce bigger homes as well, or bigger, at least more spacious or better planned or better organized homes. The question I have about sprawl is sprawl necessarily a bad thing if it brings with it a rejection of a commuter-based work culture, which we've learned through the pandemic is actually possible?
Thank you, John. I think that's a really wonderful question. And I guess my reaction to that is it depends. Like you said, you know, if sprawling is actually leading to us using the, you know, our cars generating less carbon footprint on the planet, maybe overall it's actually creating a better scenario for our environment and for our community. But to be honest with you, even when it's during the lockdown period, sometimes I have to go out to, you know, for grocery shopping and etc. I still see a lot of cars running around. I don't know where they're going. So I think just by sprawling and people are living more in the suburbs doesn't necessarily mean that we are cutting on the usage of gas and we're actually cutting on the pollution. So I think it's twofold. One thing is that we need to realize that if we're sprawling, then we probably have to do something in the long term to cut down the actual use of gasoline, the actual pollution to our environment. And maybe we need to think about other kind of public transportation system that will support that kind of a living environment. So I think those are the two things that we need to focus on if this is the direction we're going in the future.
Yeah, great answer. And a segue to a question I have for Michael, really, it really relates to the challenge in front of us to rethink and redesign the suburbs. And I know that in your work, you've begun to tackle that question in some of the projects you've taken on. And really, Fan has hit the nail on the head in identifying that living in the suburbs and not commuting to the downtown cores is not the entire answer to the problem. The answer lies in figuring out how to recreate or reimagine the suburbs so that they're less car intensive, what's the word I want? Car dependent.
Driven.
Car dependent is the word I want. And so I'd throw that question to you. You know, imagining a world in the future where more people are living and working at home, how do we need to reimagine the suburbs in order to make that a healthy way of living?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One, there's been a move for quite a long time in Ontario you know, was instigated. I'm trying to think when it happened, when the green belt was defined. Well, I mean, even going back to the Niagara Escarpment definition, and then the green belt, and then a provincial policy called the Big Move, which was really dead focused on getting people out of cars and into transit, and envisions the greater Toronto Hamilton area, and I think even now going and reaching out as far as Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, Milton, up to Barrie, as a kind of a constellation of interconnected urban nodes. And really it relies, I mean, it's a bit like the old streetcar neighborhoods of, or streetcar suburbs of Toronto, which you would take the train out and then you would pretty much be self-sustaining. Everything you needed was kind of relatively local. So I think what's really exciting about the shift with the kind of virtual world that we've been living in is that it really does, it takes that capacity of not just simply relying on transit, but the ability to live locally and turbocharges it, so that, you know, for example, people that I worked with can live and work in Guelph or London, and we work in a seamless fashion, so that the reliance on the car theoretically could be uncoupled. But then part two, you know, in the work we've been doing, you need to then curate urbanism in a kind of a petri dish. You need to do it in a calculated fashion. You need to lead with public space. You need to lead with amenity. You need to lead with a YMCA, a library, a daycare, in order that people, you know, and food and shops and places to work to actually find a way, if it's possible, and this is the question, I mean, I think we've been asking, is it possible to contrive urbanism and place in a calculated, designed way? Time will tell. I mean, that's certainly the experiment we've been pursuing in Vaughan, at the Vaughan Metropolitan Center. I'd like to think it's possible. Whether we have the right balance, time will tell, and whether the development industry is entirely aligned with that holistic vision is a tougher question. So certainly I think it's a hopeful time.
I would agree. Hope is the underlying tone and tenor for sure. I do have a question here from an audience member. I'll read it out. In a world where the ideal employee is seen as gregarious, action-oriented, decisive, confident, and bold, introverts are often undervalued, overlooked, and dismissed. Do you think the virtual world has worsened or enhanced this situation for introverts? I don't know who wants to tackle that. I think it's a really important question. Richard, go ahead.
Fantastic question. And I think these new mediums that we have access to should help. I think we have found that. And I think we've learned some better habits in our firm to just touch base with everybody more regularly and more intentionally, right? And those people that don't speak up in the team meetings, have a better opportunity, more comfort to do that. So I think, even once we're back together, we want to keep some of those habits and intentionality about engaging everybody and knowing that, our industry has a lot of very creative and very quiet people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. I mean, it's I've certainly seen with our team at the Ontario Chamber that even though we're in a digital world and we don't see each other in person anymore, we're connected more than we've ever been connected before. Through platforms and people using technology like Teams and other messaging ways that we can message each other at the workplace. People who are more introverted can use these to have interactions that aren't necessarily face to face, and still maintain a level of productivity and creativity and get their work done. So I think that on one hand, a lot of my friends who would say that they're introverted, they found a lot of comfort in the pandemic and being able to work from their homes and communicate with people through platforms like Teams.
Yeah, I would agree. In my own experience, just to supplement with Zoom meetings, I find them way more democratic in a way than regular face-to-face meetings around a board table, where there tends to be always one or two personalities that through their body language and their style of communicating dominate. Whereas in a Zoom world or in a Teams world, everyone has that same little kind of 2-inch by 3-inch square. And it tends to equalize the voices. And it doesn't mean to say that you still don't have to be intentional about how you work together and how you draw out those quieter voices, as Richard has pointed out. So I think that those are very good points. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
The one thing I would add is that, I mean, I tried to kind of briefly outline some of the things we've been doing to glue ourselves together over the last year through, a diversity of different digital domains. And what's interesting is that now that we have more than just the channel of standing up in front of the room to communicate and share knowledge, we have, we've got the ability for people to post ideas. We have the ability for people to do a white paper. We have the ability for people to pre-record a problem that they've solved and share it. We've seen a kind of a huge increase in the level of engagement because there's more than one way for people to interact. And, the kind of the idea of, creating a diversity and equity is that not one size fits all, and you need to kind of create a dynamic environment that allows for different kind of people to interact in different ways. So I think Richard, you kind of speak about being mindful of making sure that you're reaching out to everyone. I think that's the key, and creating those opportunities for people. So I'd be curious to know if the person who asked the question, what side of the equation they sit on.
Introvert or extrovert, yes, fair enough. I have another question here from the audience, which is a bit more technical, and there are no mechanical engineers on the panel, but I think it's an important question for architects and designers to answer as well. And I'll read it. I believe there is a major issue of virus spread with current ventilation standards in buildings, public transit, aircraft, and other means of transport. This is crucial as existing compliance solutions are now called into question. A new ventilation standard will likely be forthcoming. What do we think the architect's role in this conversation should be? Richard, go ahead.
Not an engineer, but I am a member of ASHRAE. And so, it has a lot of great resources about the way forward. And I like others, I'm sure you've been inundated with every system and product and technology that's now COVID ready, right? It's like the greenwashing, that happened at the start of the green building trend, So I think we need to look at, evidence-based decision-making, and again, encourage people to check out the ASHRAE resources. There's pictures, and they explain things that even architects can understand. And I think the biggest thing this is exposed, and I think Mike used the term daylighting, is the state of affairs in some of our older buildings. We do a lot of work in long-term care, and that has been and it's taken a tragedy, sadly, to expose, the deplorable state of our facilities here in Ontario. And that's the big issue. I think we do know how to do these things. And yes, sure, new systems may come forward and better understanding about, infection control will come out of this, certainly. But the fact is that we have so many old, out-of-date buildings, including schools, all kinds of other public venues, that simply don't meet even the current standards. And if they did, I think our experience would have been a lot different. So, I would advise some skepticism, you know, when your consultants recommend the latest this or the latest that. You know, what's the evidence? You know, there's obviously a natural tendency to react. But I think there's a risk, and certainly in long-term care, we're starting to see this, that, you know, there's a danger that we're going to hermetically seal off our elders from the rest of society, right? And yes, okay, they'll be safe and secure and protected the next time there's an outbreak of some kind, but at what cost? You know, and there are ways of doing both, and I think we know how to do those ways. We know what to do. We don't need to reinvent a lot of these things. They've been well documented for decades, and we just need to get caught up with what we have been, you know, postponing.
Great. Mike, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, well, I actually have it's a related question back to Richard, which would be, certainly the engineers that I've spoken to, one of the common responses to you know, dealing with COVID is things like increased ventilation rates, increased filtration, you know, bipolar ionization, increasing humidification. Every one of these things leads to a more energy intensive building. And I quickly see ourselves at odds with our aspiration for, you know, net zero energy and carbon, and how do we reconcile these two agendas? And maybe that's not a fair question, but maybe it's a request. Do you have any thoughts on this? Because I personally can't resolve the two.
Yeah, you know, it's crucial, and often, you know, these issues of thermal comfort and indoor air quality are at odds with energy performance. But you know what? They don't need to be, right? These principles have been pretty widely accepted now in our green building standards, whether it's LEED or Green Globes or Passive House. And, you know, I'm a firm believer that there is a way, you know, to do both, to have both a high quality, healthy environment, as well as one that is much less energy efficient. And as I'm sitting behind these big windows, I think glazing is a big question in my mind, you know, and I think, you know, we've the predominance of glazed buildings, especially tall, thin, you know, residential buildings, do call this into question, because I think that's where it strains our building systems to meet even the minimum performance levels. So I think it's a matter of looking at the whole picture and looking at the standards we have. You know, LEED talks to those exact issues and how you reconcile them.
I'd have a point to that to add as well. You know, to Richard's earlier point around having well-ventilated workplaces, you know, I have a question for the architects in the room. I think about the return to work and the return to our office spaces, and it's crazy to think, but you can't open windows in an office space to have well-ventilated workspaces. So, you know, will that change in terms of design and how we design office buildings, even the new buildings that you can't open windows, maybe even just a crack? So is that something that will be taken into account?
Who wants to respond to that? That's a very good question, actually.
Oh,
Well,
go ahead. You go, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been on virtually every project I've ever worked on. I've tried to advocate for operable windows. It's just simply put, I've never been in a building that in the shoulder seasons where the mechanical system actually works particularly well, and I would love to be able to crack open a window. Often, whether it's owners, I mean, it could be a question of cost. It can be a question, more often than not in an institutional environment, there's a question of occupants basically not taking responsibility for shutting the window. And it becomes a real drag for the operators of the buildings to have these buildings that are blowing, you know, heat or cold out the window. Because of a user that isn't kind of taking responsibility, and that's usually the reason and the alibi for getting rid of operable windows. I mean, and if you look at people who are, obsessed with, the airtightness of buildings, operable windows are inevitably leakier. So if you're looking for a high performance building, they become an easy target. I don't think any of those are justified, really, but it is, I would say, most architects lobby for them and take a bit of a beating on it. Richard, sorry, I jumped in before you.
Well, yeah, again, a fundamental aspect of green buildings is operable windows. And, being able to open a window in your living or workspace, it humanizes it, right? It gives you good control, especially here in this part of the world. There's so many of those shoulder seasons, as Mike said, that, it's beautiful outside. Today being an example. And I think, we've learned a lot about how to, I like to say when we talk about operable windows, with power comes responsibility, right? And there's a kind of a misunderstanding that, on a hot day, any building system is designed only to the 90th percentile of the hottest day of the year, right? So there's going to be some days where it's going to be getting too warm. And when you open that window on those days, you bypassed our highly tuned, super efficient systems, and you're letting that hot, humid air directly into your room. So I think, people just need to understand, what that means. And there's also, back in the before times when I've stayed in newer hotels, there's a little contact that you can do. It's a little wireless contact, and it'll just cut the system off when you open the window. Simple. And, you look for it next time you go back to a hotel. There'll be a little sign that says, hey, you're welcome to open the sliding door or the window, but just FYI, that will turn off the system. Very simple.
Yeah.
I just have something to add to that. I think the scenarios that Richard and Michael have described would be very suitable for large-scale office buildings, right? But I just want to remind everybody that there's still a very large percentage of business that are small business. So the office spaces, they are small office spaces, which means I think there is a very good potential that after the pandemic, after people realize how important air circulation is, I believe for these, at least for these smaller buildings, changes would be easier when it comes to design of these office spaces. That could be something that as architects or engineers, we can definitely integrate into our design in the future.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And it's necessary to remind us that the vast majority of our building stock is in that category.
Right.
And retrofitting those buildings is going to be an important challenge for the future. It already is an important challenge when we look at those buildings from the perspective of the climate crisis. But now we need to layer on top of that this desire for improved ventilation. I do have a question from the audience directed towards Richard, but I would think it also might be of interest to Kiara. The question is, everyone is talking about jobs and businesses. What about our children and youth? How will we adapt to make sure education can happen in the future without interruption and taking a toll on the mental health of the next generation?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. When I think about, just to bring it back to women's participation in the workforce again, young women, so our youth. So when I think about my two younger sisters who are about to enter the workforce, so they fall into that category of sort of finishing school, about to enter the workforce. They are actually at the lowest rates right now of unemployment that they were prior to the pandemic when we look at employment rates. So I think that we need to spur, the reskilling and spur people and youth into professions where they'll, be passionate about what they're doing, because of course that's important, but also into high growth professions and as well as that are creative. We're not seeing a lot of women enter into technology sectors, into the skilled trades. I think that, empowering youth to learn different careers, to participate, when it is time to enter the workforce, will be crucial for our recovery, as well as crucial for, our youth who want to explore different areas of learning. I also, that you also mentioned mental health in your question. And when I look at, my younger siblings, I can see the toll that virtual school and, you know, not being able to have contact with their peers has had on their mental health, and it's absolutely staggering. It was mentioned earlier in this panel, but we already have a mental health crisis, and the next crisis definitely that we will continue to tackle for all ages, especially for our youth, will be one around mental health. So I think that we need to ensure that in our schools, and that when people enter, that when our young people enter the workplace, that we're giving them the mental health supports so that people are able to learn and people are able to be creative and function within society.
Richard, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that issue of flexibility, you know, for young parents, you know, I think it's something we turned our mind to here for the young people in my office that have small children, and giving them the freedom, because it's an unpredictable. I remember back in those days, you just never knew what was going to come home, you know, and who's going to get the sniffles or whatever. So I think that's kind of the first thought I would have, you know, how we can support the education system in that small way, just by making it easier for parents to stay home or spend time and be more flexible about that through the tools we've now learned how to use. My partner Allison does a lot of work in education and in elementary schools in particular. And you're starting to see those buildings being more than just a school. You know, the same way we think of libraries now, not merely as libraries, but as community resource centers. Mm. In fact, many libraries becoming part of schools. And, you know, in this part of Ontario, there's been a huge trend in closing small rural schools, right? Because they just don't have the numbers of children to make the buildings viable. And, you know, when that happens in a small town, it's really devastating, you know, because it's more than a school to those communities. You know, they've lost their meeting place, they've lost a place, you know, even for an emergency, you know. So I think we need to use those buildings differently and think of them differently. And frankly, I think the municipalities have to appreciate that schools are more than schools, and they're very important parts of the community that you know, need to have help from all sectors.
Great points. I do have another question. It might be the next to final one before we wrap up, but one of our audience members is asking the panel to speak to the issue of emerging architects, i.e. interns, in our atomized remote working paradigm that we live in now. Is it a better or worse context for internship working remotely? A couple of the panelists have spoken about how important the studio environment is from the point of view of nurturing creativity and cultivating the work. There seems to be kind of two sides to this question. Will interns flourish more in a remote working environment, or is that studio environment so essential for the nurturing of young creative talent that you can't find a replacement for it in the virtual world?
Maybe I could speak to that a little bit from my own personal experience. So I've gone through the internship program myself before becoming a licensed architect. And that was, you know, sitting in the office more than 8 hours a day and learning from my peers and my superiors. So from that experience, I do think it's crucial to have that contact. And from the experience in the past year of, you know, doing meetings virtually, doing sketches on the whiteboard, using all kinds of apps, I still don't think it matches to the level of efficiency and productivity in terms of or compared to sitting next to your superior who can show you the working drawings or you know, the shop drawings and pointing out where exactly, you know, you need to focus on, why this is not working, why this is, you know, a better detail compared to that one. I think the level of kind of efficiency there, it just doesn't match, unfortunately. So speaking just purely from my personal experience, I do think it is really important to still have that contact. Maybe the other senior architects could speak to that.
Well, we've learned so much from our young team members, you know, whether they're interns or even co-op students. They're full of amazing questions and very versatile with the social media. And I still don't know all my emoji etiquette yet. So, we've learned a huge amount from that group of people. And, we've had a couple of people join us over the past few months that haven't actually worked in the office physically yet, and it's been obviously really hard to integrate them. And we know we've got a lot of work to do with those people in particular once we are able to get back together. I do want to say one thing to that community of young interns entering this profession. I don't think there's been a better time in history to be somebody your age than right now. Yes, we're entering a world of turmoil, but also tremendous opportunity. And you're part of the digital generation, digital natives, as you're called. And so you have the ability to take advantage of these opportunities. So good for you. Hang in there.
Great point, and a great way to segue into a wrap-up. What I'd like to do to conclude, before I thank the panelists, is invite each of them in turn to provide a closing comment or two. We have about 4 minutes left in our allotted time, and I'll go through the same order as the presentations. I'll start with Fan. Fan, your thoughts in wrapping up this discussion? I know it's only the beginning, but.
First of all, I want to say that I'm really happy to hear many of the comments that, Kira, Richard, and Michael mentioned, such as the importance of bringing flexibility to women and to maybe younger families, and bringing equity into our groups, because I think that's really, really important, especially for a creative force, a creative industry that we're in. So unfortunately, we can't talk more about that because of the time restraint, but I'm just really happy that you mentioned these points. And I hope that we could eventually find this balance between flexibility and this urge or this need to physically be together to do maybe like creative jam sessions or whatever. And I'm beginning to think of different ideas that I hope in the future we may have the opportunity to discuss more.
Thank you, Fan. Richard, any concluding thoughts, comments?
I would mainly just like to thank you, John, and the other panelists. We didn't know each other, 48 hours ago. And I just really appreciate the diversity of this discussion and the optimistic tone, notwithstanding the challenges ahead of us. So I just want to say thank you for giving that encouragement to the listeners.
You're very welcome, and thank you for your contribution to the discussion. Kiara, any final thoughts about the discussion?
Thank you so much for having me. I've learned so much on this panel today, and my final thought would be how we can continue to spur inclusivity, entrepreneurship, innovation, and creativity when it comes to designing the new normal and what that will mean for all of us here today.
Thank you, Kira. Michael, your final thought.
Some great comments. I would close out by saying what's really extraordinary about today in this kind of conversation is the intimacy of our exchange. And I think that's something we've gained from being holed up in our houses. It has collapsed and broken down a lot of barriers of sort of traditional silos. I think if we had all been sitting behind a table in a conference center, we wouldn't have had as candid and open a conversation. So going forward, I'd love to see that the benefit of this format is retained, because I think a lot is gained from it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And from my perspective, I want to conclude by saying that I'm really struck by the strong intersection between the pandemic response and this question of resiliency and the other compelling issues of our time, that being the climate crisis and diversity, equity, and inclusion. To me, these three issues, public health, DEI, and climate action, overlay almost synchronously on top of each other. And I think there is an enormous opportunity in front of us out of this crisis to elevate the care and attention we give to these other two compelling issues that are societally important for the future. So, and on that note, I'd like to wrap up by thanking all of you, Kiara, Fan, Michael, Richard. It's been a great conversation. It's unfortunate it has to end because I suspect we could go on talking about this for quite a lot longer if we were given the time. But I have no doubt that the conversation will continue virtually in the future as we've gotten to know each other. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who has watched today, and thank you for your questions. It's really helped shape the conversation, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, John.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.